Hello, friends. We are diving into the depths of the past to help you fall asleep easily and usefully. Don't forget to subscribe and like right now, because by the end of our conversation, you will be fast asleep. Close your eyes. The story is already beginning. Imagine that one day you wake up, go outside, and the world around you is no longer the same as you are used to. The city is empty. The phones are silent. Information is no longer transmitted. Chaos reigns all around, and the most terrible thing is the complete lack of understanding of what to do next. This scenario is the quintessence of human fear of the end of the world. We are afraid not just of destruction, but above all of the unknown, loss of control, the collapse of the usual order. Psychologists say that fear of the end of the world is closely linked to the loss of predictability. People are used to living in a world where everything is subject to a certain rhythm. The sun rises in the morning, spring replaces winter, and time flows within the usual framework. Any idea of the apocalypse destroys this sense of stability, plunging consciousness into chaos. Moreover, the unknown is often more frightening than the catastrophe itself. People are not afraid of death itself. It is an inevitable part of life that humanity faces every day. But we are terrified of not knowing what will happen next. Will it be an instant end or a protracted destruction stretched out over time? Will the world after the catastrophe be empty, or will something beyond ordinary destruction await us? This fear is amplified many times over when it becomes collective. If one person is worried, they will look for a way out. But when fear is fueled by society, be it religious prophecies, scientific theories, or rumors on social media, it becomes a powerful cultural phenomenon. That's why myths about the end of the world have existed throughout history, from the ancient Sumerians and Mayans to modern conspiracy theorists. Interestingly, talk of the end of the world most often intensifies during periods of social and political upheaval. History shows that the more unstable a society becomes, the more people begin to think about a global catastrophe. When chaos is felt in the world, when familiar ways of life are collapsing, when illnesses cause anxiety, ancient archetypes of destruction come to life in the mass consciousness. Let's recall ancient Rome at the end of the 1st century AD. Frequent changes of emperors, instability in the state, popular unrest. It was at this time that Christian ideas about the coming Last Judgment began to spread. In the Middle Ages, expectations of the end of the world were especially strong during epidemics, when the plague mowed down entire cities, and people saw it as God's punishment. Even in modern times, we are seeing similar processes. For example, in 1999, fear of a computer failure with the onset of the year 2000 gave rise to a real mass psychosis. People expected the collapse of civilization simply because the date in the system would change. But the most interesting thing is that in many cultures, the end of the world is not final destruction, but rebirth. In Scandinavian mythology, after Ragnarok, a new earth remains, where the surviving people and gods begin a new era. The Mayan books describe that our world is neither the first nor the last. Before it, there were other eras, each of which ended in disaster, but then a new one appeared. In Hinduism, Kali Yuga, the current dark era, will end in destruction, but it will certainly be followed by a new golden age. So, fear of the end of the world is not only anxiety about a catastrophe. The myths are based on the idea of cyclicality. The world is destroyed, but after it, a new one always arises. These myths, in a sense, are comforting. They tell us chaos is inevitable, but it is always followed by order. In this sense, myths about the end of the world are not only an expression of fear, but also a deep hope for renewal. Stories about the end of the world don't just pop up out of nowhere. They draw inspiration from ancient texts, natural phenomena, and even real-life disasters that humanity has experienced over the millennia. But the most interesting thing is not only where these myths came from, but also why people kept passing them down from generation to generation. Perhaps some of the most vivid and detailed descriptions of the end of the world come from ancient texts from different cultures, geographies, and eras. All of these sources paint a similar picture. The world collapses, descends into chaos, and then is invariably reborn. One of the key sources of ideas about the end of the world in Northern Europe is the Elder Edda. Its lines describe Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods and the destruction of the world. This myth is filled with symbolism. An icy winter without sun, the uprising of monsters, the death of the gods in battle, and the subsequent revival of nature. Many researchers believe that this myth could reflect real climate changes, such as a sudden cold snap caused by a volcanic eruption or other natural disaster. The Bible offers several end-of-the-world narratives. The Great Flood in Genesis describes God destroying humanity for its sins, leaving only Noah and his family alive. This narrative is found not only in Judaism and Christianity, but also in Sumerian texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The overlapping details suggest cultural exchange in ancient Mesopotamia. For the Mayan civilization, the end of the world was not a final destruction, but a change of cycles. The sacred book Popol Vuh tells how several worlds already existed before ours, but they were destroyed due to the imperfection of the first people. One world was flooded, another was destroyed by fire. The change of eras through catastrophes is also characteristic of other Mesoamerican civilizations. For example, the Aztecs believed that the current world is the fifth in a row, and it will perish in fire and earthquakes. The question of how much myths about the end of the world are based on real events has long been a concern for scientists. In recent decades, archaeology and geology have provided more and more data on possible catastrophes that served as the basis for these legends. One of the most popular hypotheses connects the biblical flood with a geological catastrophe in the Black Sea region about 7,500 years ago. The level of the Mediterranean Sea rose sharply, and water rushed into the Black Sea, flooding huge areas. For people living in these places, this really could have looked like the end of the world. Around 1600 BC, one of the most powerful eruptions in history shook the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. It caused a gigantic tsunami that destroyed the Minoan civilization on Crete. Some researchers believe that this cataclysm could have given rise to the myths about the destruction of Atlantis and even the plagues of Egypt. Possible collisions of Earth with meteorites have also left their mark on myths. For example, the Tunguska event of 1908 caused an explosion with the power of hundreds of atomic bombs. But if it had happened over a densely populated region, it could well have given rise to a new myth about the wrath of the gods and the end of the world. But many of these theories are attempts to explain real catastrophes. Why did they persist for centuries and spread even among those who did not witness the events? One of the most striking myths in which the end of the world is presented not only as a tragedy, but also as an inevitable renewal, is Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods in the Scandinavian tradition. This myth has come down to us through oral traditions and ancient texts, but has undergone significant changes over time, reflecting the influence of new religions and historical events. Ragnarok is one of the most famous myths about the end of the world, coming to us from the Scandinavian tradition. It is the story of the last battle of the gods, the destruction of the world, and its subsequent rebirth. However, as with other ancient myths, the idea of Ragnarok did not form overnight, but developed over the centuries, absorbing the influence of various traditions, oral traditions, and even religious ideas that appeared in Scandinavia with the advent of Christianity. The main written sources describing Ragnarok are two key texts: the Elder Edda and the Younger Edda. The Elder Edda, also known as the Poetic Edda, is a collection of mythological and heroic songs written down in the 10th century, but based on much older oral traditions. One of the most important songs, the Völuspá, contains a detailed description of the events of Ragnarok, including the signs of the approaching catastrophe, the awakening of monsters, the death of the gods, and the subsequent renewal of the world. This text is considered one of the oldest and most authentic evidence of Scandinavian beliefs, as it shows noticeably less influence from the Christian tradition compared to later sources. The Prose Edda, also known as the Prose Edda, was written in the 13th century by Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson. Unlike the Elder Edda, this text is a more systematic and retold version of Scandinavian mythology, adapted for contemporary understanding. Snorri's description of Ragnarok shows the influence of Christian ideas about the end of the world, which is especially noticeable in the details of the subsequent rebirth of the world. For example, after the destruction of the world, Snorri creates a new earth on which righteous souls will live, and the myth itself takes on the features of a linear narrative, similar to the Christian idea of the apocalypse and the coming kingdom of God. However, despite the existence of written sources, it should be remembered that the myth of Ragnarok existed for a long time in the form of oral traditions. The Scandinavians did not have a developed written language. Their religious beliefs were passed down from generation to generation through tales, ritual chants, and performances by skalds, ancient poets who performed epic poems at the courts of kings and earls. It was in this oral tradition that details of the myth could have been contained that did not make it into written sources or were distorted when they were written down. Moreover, the myth of Ragnarok was formed in a complex cultural environment where pagan beliefs gradually clashed with Christianity. During the period of Christianization of Scandinavia, which was especially active from the 9th to the 12th century, Viking mythology inevitably underwent changes. The new religion sought to displace old beliefs, but could not immediately erase them from the people's consciousness. Therefore, many elements of Scandinavian mythology began to be interpreted through the prism of Christian symbolism. For example, the idea that only the surviving righteous souls will remain in the new world after Ragnarok could have been borrowed from the Christian concept of the Last Judgment. Another possible influence of Christianity is the image of the great wolf Fenrir, who tears apart and absorbs Odin on the day of Ragnarok. Some researchers see in this a parallel with the Christian image of Satan, who was bound in the abyss, but at the end of time will be released to bring destruction before the final victory of good. Ragnarok is not an instantaneous catastrophe, but a series of signs and events that foreshadow the inevitable. It begins with disturbing harbingers, followed by the destruction of order. The battle of the gods and the final fire sweep away everything, so that a new world can emerge in its place. The first sign of the approaching end is the Great Winter, known as Fimbulwinter. These are 3 gloomy winters, one after another, without a change to summer. The sky is overcast, the sun seems to lose its strength, and the snowstorms never cease. The cold penetrates all corners of the world, turning rivers into ice, making the soil sterile and destroying crops. Famine sets in, igniting cruelty in the hearts of men. By this time, the human world is already engulfed in chaos. Brothers turn against each other. No one can trust even their own family. Betrayal and the disintegration of social norms reign everywhere. Wars break out all over the world, and with each passing day it becomes clear the old order is crumbling and no one can save it. As the world descends into chaos, ancient monsters awaken from the depths, their rage predetermined by fate. The great wolf Fenrir, bound by the gods since childhood, breaks his bonds and is set free. So great is his strength that he can swallow a whole celestial body. The serpent Jormungandr rises from the ocean, writhing across the world and poisoning it with his breath. From Muspelheim, the land of fire, the giant Surt emerges with a sword that sparkles like the sun. All these are signs that the final battle has begun, a battle in which even the gods will not be able to escape their fate. On the battlefield called Vigrid, the forces of gods and monsters meet. Odin fights Fenrir, but his fate has long been sealed. The wolf seizes him with its giant jaws and swallows him. The great Thor enters the battle with Jormungandr, destroying the serpent with his hammer. But only a few steps after the victory, he himself falls, poisoned by the deadly fumes of the monster. Loki, a former ally of the gods, now stands against Heimdall, and in this battle they kill each other. At this moment, the giant Surt raises his flaming sword and incinerates the entire world. Waves of fire engulf the earth, the sky cracks, and all living things turn to ashes. Ragnarok is not just a myth about the end of the world, but a symbolic story filled with deep meanings. It can be seen not only as a mythological prophecy, but also as an allegory of historical change, an attempt to understand the chaos and destruction that invariably accompany the change of eras. This is why it remains relevant even centuries after it was written down. One of the most interesting interpretations of Ragnarok is its understanding as a change of eras. The plot is based on the idea of the death of the old world, which was full of conflicts, suffering, and sins, so that a new, renewed world could be born in its place. A similar concept is found in many cultures. For example, the Mayan civilization believed that our world is not the first, but only one of many cycles. And Hinduism describes the Kali Yuga, a time of moral decline, after which destruction and a new golden age will inevitably come. Parallels can also be drawn with the Christian apocalypse. The description of Ragnarok is in many ways reminiscent of the end-time prophecy in the book of Revelation. In both cases, there is a series of omens, natural disasters, the fall of great powers, and the final battle between good and evil. In the Christian tradition, after the Day of Judgment, a new world remains where only the righteous live. Just as after Ragnarok, the earth is renewed, and the surviving souls begin a new era. Some researchers suggest that Christian ideas may have influenced later versions of the myth, especially those written down in the 13th century, after Christianity had spread to Scandinavia. But could the Ragnarok myth be inspired by real events? Scientists have repeatedly looked for possible events that could have left a mark on the collective memory of the ancient Scandinavians. One hypothesis links the legend to climate change that occurred in the 6th century, when a series of volcanic eruptions led to a sharp cold snap, crop failure, and mass famine. The Scandinavians may have remembered this crisis as the eternal winter, which was later reflected in the myth of Fimbulwinter. Another theory links Ragnarok to the eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland, or possible meteorite strikes that caused a solar eclipse and global catastrophes. Despite its ancient roots, Ragnarok remains one of the most popular myths in popular culture. It has appeared many times in books, films, and video games, changing depending on the era. In the 20th century, the myth was often interpreted as a premonition of global wars, including World War I and World War II. In modern pop culture, it has become part of the image of Norse mythology, especially through Marvel comics and films, where it is presented in a more entertaining format. In games such as God of War or Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it is shown as a dramatic moment when the old order collapses and heroes face their destiny. Thus, Ragnarok is a myth of destruction and rebirth that can be interpreted in different ways depending on the context, be it a historical change of eras, religious predictions, or real natural disasters. This myth continues to resonate in the human consciousness, making it one of the most significant and enduring stories in human history. When it comes to ancient doomsday prophecies, one of the most famous examples is the Mayan calendar and the predictions allegedly associated with the date December 21, 2012. At the beginning of the 21st century, this idea gave rise to a real cultural phenomenon: disaster movies, pseudo-scientific theories. But is it true? Or is it just an interpretation error? The myth that the Mayans predicted the end of the world arose due to the peculiarities of their calendar system. Unlike the linear chronology we are accustomed to, the Mayans used cycles based on the so-called ktuns, time periods, each of which lasted approximately 395 years. One great cycle of the calendar consisted of 13 ktuns and covered a period of 5,125 years. This cycle, according to calculations, ended exactly on December 21, 2012, which gave rise to rumors of the coming apocalypse. However, for the Mayans themselves, this did not mean the end of all things, but only a change of era. Just as in modern culture, the end of a millennium is perceived not as the end of the world, but as an important historical milestone. The real essence of the Mayan calendar is connected with their ideas about time as repeating cycles. They believed that each world exists for a certain period of time and is then replaced by a new one. In their mythology, there were already several such worlds. According to the book Popol Vuh, the previous worlds were destroyed by flood, fire, or monsters, and our modern world is already the fourth or fifth attempt at divine creation. However, no Mayan source claims that the world will end after the current cycle ends. One of the few archaeological sources that actually mentions the date December 21, 2012 is an inscription from Tortuguero, an ancient Mayan monument in the Mexican state of Tabasco. This text states that on this day, the 13th Baktun, a period associated with war, chaos, and change, will end. However, the rest of the text is damaged, and it is impossible to say exactly what was supposed to happen. Moreover, many other Mayan texts mention dates well beyond 2012, confirming that they did not consider this moment to be the end of time. Thus, the myth of the end of the world in 2012 arose from a misunderstanding of the concept of time in the Mayan culture. They did not predict the end of the world, but only spoke of the end of one cycle and the beginning of a new one. The Mayas' ideas about the end of the world were much more complex than the popular myths about the predicted apocalypse in 2012. Their worldview was based on the idea of cyclical time, and their mythology viewed the world structure as a temporary construct that comes to destruction only to be reborn anew. This concept is most clearly manifested in their idea of the fifth sun, the era in which we live today. According to Mayan cosmology, the universe exists in the form of successive worlds, each of which lives for a certain number of years and then perishes in a catastrophe. They believed that before our time there were worlds ruled by different gods, but sooner or later they all came to an end. This concept is in many ways similar to the ideas of other civilizations, such as the Aztecs, who also used the term fifth sun to refer to the current era. According to this theory, we live in a world that was preceded by ruined civilizations, each of which was destroyed by the elements: water, wind, fire, and earth. However, no source says that the end of the fifth sun will necessarily occur on a predetermined date. It is only an inevitable process that will happen someday, but its exact timing is unknown. Mayan cosmology presents the world as a temporary construct created by the gods, but doomed to destruction. They did not perceive the existence of the universe as something permanent or eternal. Everything moves according to a predetermined cycle, and when one era ends, another begins. In this regard, their worldview differs from the linear concept of time common in the Abrahamic religions, but is similar to the Hindu concept of great time cycles replacing each other. One of the most important myths associated with the end of the previous world is the legend of the flood. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, tells how the gods created the first people, but they turned out to be imperfect. The first people were made of clay, but they were too fragile, and the rains washed them off the face of the earth. Then the gods tried to create them out of wood, but the wooden people did not have a soul, and did not pay respect to their creators, for which they were destroyed by the great flood. After this, the gods created new people from maize dough, and only they became true people, worthy of living in the world created by the gods. This myth reflects the importance of maize to Mayan culture, as well as their idea that humanity was the first attempt of the gods, and the result of a long process of trial and error. Thus, in the actual Mayan predictions about the end of the world, there is no specific date or precise prophecy about the coming catastrophe. They perceived the world as temporary and knew that it would disappear sooner or later, but did not try to determine the exact moment of its destruction. History does not end with its classical period, much less with myths about the end of the world. On the contrary, their cultural and religious beliefs continued to exist and change even after contact with Europeans. One of the most striking facts is how the Mayan religion adapted to colonization, retroactively incorporating elements of Christianity into their old myths. When the Spanish conquered the Mayan lands in the 15th century, they sought to eradicate paganism, but it proved impossible to completely destroy the ancient faith. As a result, a unique form of religious syncretism emerged, in which traditional Mayan gods and myths were intertwined with Catholic symbolism. For example, the sun god Kinich Ahau became associated with the image of Jesus Christ, and the underworld of Xibalba was compared to the Christian hell. Many Mayan rituals and holidays did not disappear, but simply received a new interpretation. Sacrifices were replaced with prayers, and ancient temples became places of Christian worship. This process can be compared to how the Vikings adapted their beliefs to Christianity, or how African cults formed into voodoo and Santeria. Another aspect that is rarely discussed is the real catastrophes that may have contributed to the decline of the Maya civilization. Despite the mystical aura surrounding their myths, archaeological evidence suggests that their demise was not due to prophecies, but to very tangible crises. Climate studies point to long droughts that began around the 8th century and may have led to water shortages and famine. Additionally, frequent earthquakes destroyed cities, making the situation worse. It is even possible that rebellions by the lower classes were another factor that undermined the stability of the Maya world. As a result, by the 13th century, most of their cities were abandoned, and the descendants of the ancient Maya found themselves facing Spanish expansion. Thus, the Mayan religious beliefs not only survived colonization, but also continued to evolve. Their civilization disappeared not because of a mystical prophecy, but under the influence of real catastrophes, and the very concept of the cyclical nature of the world makes their beliefs related to the myths of other peoples. The story of the Great Flood is one of the most widespread myths in world culture. It is found on different continents and in many different traditions, but everywhere it conveys a similar meaning. A world engulfed in chaos or sin is submerged underwater, only to be renewed. The question arises, why is the myth of the flood so universal? Is it a memory of a real catastrophe, or is it an archetype reflecting ancient fears of the element of water? One of the most famous versions of the flood myth is found in the Bible. According to the book of Genesis, God saw that humanity was mired in sin and decided to destroy it, leaving only the righteous Noah and his family alive. At God's command, Noah built the ark, where he placed animals in pairs of each species, after which torrential rains fell upon the earth, and the waters flooded the entire world. After 40 days, the flood began to subside. The ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, and Noah released a dove, which brought an olive branch, a symbol of hope and a new beginning. In this story, the flood acts as a divine punishment, but at the same time as a purification, after which humanity is given a second chance. However, the biblical flood myth has obvious parallels with the older Sumerian tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written down several millennia before the Bible, tells of King Utnapishtim, who is informed by the gods of an impending flood and ordered to build a large ship. Utnapishtim saves his family, craftsmen, and animals. After the waters subside, he makes sacrifices to the gods, for which he receives immortality. This plot almost completely coincides with the story of Noah's Ark, which suggests that the biblical myth may have been borrowed from, or at least inspired by, Sumerian sources. Greek mythology also has a flood story, but its emphasis is slightly different. Zeus was angry with humans for their wickedness and decided to destroy them. However, the god Prometheus warned his son Deucalion. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha built an ark, survived the disaster, and, finding themselves on Mount Parnassus, became the parents of a new humanity. Unlike the biblical myth, where humans already existed, the Greek myth makes Deucalion and Pyrrha the only survivors, and the creation of a new humanity occurs symbolically. They throw stones behind them, from which men and women are born. This emphasizes the idea of not only punishment, but also purification, renewal, and a new order. Interestingly, flood myths are found not only in Europe and the Middle East, but all over the world. In India, in the Mahabharata, there is a story about salvation from the coming flood with the help of a divine fish. In the Chinese tradition, there is a myth about the Great Yu, who, after a catastrophic flood, taught people to control water and build dams. In the myths of the peoples of America, from the Aztecs to the Incas, are also stories about the flood. One hypothesis is that it is linked to memories of real floods that left a deep mark on the memory of ancient peoples. For example, some scholars associate the flood legend with the flooding of the Black Sea, about 7,500 years ago, when water from the Mediterranean Sea burst into the Black Sea, raising its level sharply. Another theory links the flood myth to climate change after the last ice age, when melting glaciers led to massive floods. But there is another explanation. The flood myth is a universal symbol of destruction and renewal, a reflection of the idea that before a new order can begin, the old world must be destroyed. Water in mythology often symbolizes purification. It is not surprising that different cultures, independently of each other, have arrived at a similar idea of the flood as a grand transition from one world to another. The myths of the Great Flood may seem purely symbolic, but a growing body of research suggests that they may be based on real geological events. While ancient peoples may have interpreted these events as punishment from the gods, they were actually attempts to explain catastrophic natural phenomena that had left an indelible mark on their collective memory. One of the most common hypotheses links the flood myth to the global melting of glaciers that occurred about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Huge masses of ice that covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt, The water released after a 1,000-year cold snap flooded low-lying areas, destroying the coastal settlements of ancient people. This process may have lasted for centuries, but its consequences were colossal. Large-scale floods could seem apocalyptic. Another hypothesis, which we have already mentioned, connects the biblical flood with a geological catastrophe in the Black Sea region. According to geologists, about 7,500 years ago, the level of the Mediterranean Sea rose sharply, and water broke through into the Black Sea, flooding huge territories that were previously dry land. They were flooded, and the freshwater lake turned into a salt sea. For the people who inhabited these lands, the catastrophe really could have looked like the end of the world. Strong streams of water destroyed their settlements, forcing them to flee, and memories of this event could eventually transform into the myth of the Great Flood. Another hypothesis considers tsunamis and megafloods as a possible source of the flood myth. There are cases in the history of the Earth where giant waves caused by underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions could instantly destroy coastal civilizations. For example, a volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini about 3,600 years ago caused a colossal tsunami that hit the coast of Crete and other parts of the Aegean region. Perhaps similar catastrophes occurred in earlier eras, leaving behind only memories that over time turned into myths. But could a group of people survive such a flood? Historical examples show that there could indeed be survivors. If the flood lasted long enough, people would have time to escape to higher ground, or even build floating structures like those described in myths. It is quite possible that stories of heroes escaping death in the water are ancient tales of those who managed to survive natural disasters. Thus, flood myths, no matter how fantastic they may seem, may have real natural foundations. Catastrophic climate change, tectonic processes, and natural disasters could have left a mark on the memory of ancient civilizations, turning into some of the most enduring stories in human history. But where did the idea of the Ark come from? A floating refuge in which the chosen ones are saved from destruction. The image has a practical origin. Ancient people, faced with floods, could build rafts or boats to wait out the water. Archaeologists find traces of primitive wooden structures in places where catastrophic rises in water occurred thousands of years ago. However, the Ark is not just a ship, but a symbol of salvation and hope. It is given by divine command, and its inhabitants are either righteous people like Noah or people carrying knowledge and culture that should be preserved for the future world. In later interpretations, the Ark becomes an image of any refuge that offers a chance for survival, from medieval fortresses to modern concepts of spaceships that could save humanity in the event of a global catastrophe. In our time, the flood myth takes on new forms linked to modern fears. Human-induced climate change is increasingly perceived as a new Great Flood. Rising sea levels, melting glaciers, extreme weather events. All this makes people think about the future of the planet. Scenarios are discussed in scientific circles in which coastal cities could be underwater, and millions of people are forced to migrate in search of safe lands. These concerns are reflected in popular culture, from post-apocalyptic films in which the world is submerged in water, to real-life studies modeling the possible consequences of a climate catastrophe. Unlike myths that depict the end of the world as destruction and catastrophe, Zoroastrianism offers a different concept, frashokereti, which can be translated as renewal or bringing the world to perfection. In this religious tradition, the end of the world does not mean the death of humanity, but on the contrary, represents the final victory of good over evil and the restoration of divine order. According to Zoroastrian teaching, the world was created by the god Ahura Mazda, pure and perfect, but the evil spirit Angra Mainyu, Ahriman, brought chaos, disease, war, and death to it. Since then, the history of mankind has been a struggle between light and dark forces, in which people play a key role. Each person, by their actions, brings closer either the victory of good or the strengthening of evil. However, this battle is not eternal. At the end of time, there will be a decisive battle, in which Ahura Mazda and his immortal assistants will finally destroy Angra Mainyu and all the forces of darkness. Fire, which plays a central role in Zoroastrianism, will become an instrument of purification. The world will pass through molten metal, which will destroy evil, but the righteous will be able to pass through it without experiencing fear. After this, a new era will begin, the era of perfection. All the dead will be resurrected, but in a new form, without diseases and vices. Humanity will unite. Conflicts and suffering will disappear, and the earth itself will become a paradise. Ahura Mazda will establish an eternal order in which evil will no longer be able to manifest itself. This myth differs from many other ideas about the end of the world in that it is filled with optimism. If in Ragnarok the world perishes in fire, and in the Christian apocalypse terrible disasters precede the day of judgment, then in Zoroastrianism the end of the world is a long-awaited deliverance from all evil. In fact, this is not the end, but the beginning of an ideal world in which the original plan of the Creator is fulfilled. Interestingly, many elements of Zoroastrianism find echoes in later religions. For example, the idea of resurrection of the dead is present in Christianity and Islam, and the final battle of light and darkness is reminiscent of eschatological stories of different cultures. This shows that even such ancient myths as Zoroastrian continue to influence people's worldviews, shaping the idea of the future and the hope for the final triumph of justice. In the Japanese mythological tradition, there is no single eschatological idea that the world is not eternal, and its existence depends on maintaining harmony between gods, nature, and people. If this balance is disturbed, the world may come to an end. The Shinto concept of the universe is based on the idea of kami, divine spirits that control the elements, natural phenomena, and even human destinies. As long as people revere the gods and maintain order, the world exists. But if traditions are forgotten and the moral and natural order is disturbed, the gods may turn away from humanity, and chaos will ensue. In this sense, Japanese eschatology is not based on a single decisive event, but is associated with a gradual decline due to the loss of sacred balance. However, some Japanese myths feature a character whose return is associated with the end of the world. Susanoo, the god of storm and chaos. In traditional myths, he is depicted as a violent force that, although belonging to the pantheon of major gods, often acts against established norms. According to some traditions, at the end of time, he will return to destroy the world, just as the Scandinavian Loki or the Hindu Kalki bring an end to the old era. Unlike Ragnarok, where the battle between good and evil ends with the rebirth of the new world, Japanese myths do not give a clear answer to the question of what will happen after the destruction. This idea of chaos as a threat to the world order is reflected in Japanese culture and philosophy. In historical periods of crisis, such as civil wars and natural disasters, the Japanese often perceived events as signs of the loss of harmony. In literature and cinema, this motif also manifests itself in images of apocalyptic catastrophes, which symbolize the loss of connection between people, nature, and the spiritual world. Thus, the Japanese concept of the end of the world is not associated with an inevitable apocalyptic event, but with a state of the world dependent on the observance of a sacred order. In this sense, it resembles some Buddhist ideas about the gradual deterioration of the world until its complete destruction, after which a new cycle of existence can begin. Slavic mythology does not have a single, clear idea of the end of the world, similar to the Scandinavian Ragnarok or the Christian apocalypse. However, in folk beliefs, there are images and prophecies that can be interpreted as harbingers of the end of time, caused by a violation of the natural order, followed by chaos, darkness, or a purifying fire. One of the symbols of chaos in Slavic folklore is Morok, a spirit associated with darkness, fear, and delusion. In folk tales, he does not so much bring the end of the world as he envelops people's minds, plunging them into sin. According to beliefs, if the world plunges into chaos and loses touch with traditions and divine order, people will fall under the power of Morok, which will lead to the complete disintegration of society. In this sense, the idea of spiritual darkness as a sign of a coming cataclysm is similar to the idea of moral decline in Buddhist and Christian eschatology. Another motif found in Slavic legends is the destruction of the world by fire. Some tales speak of a burning sea or flame that will engulf the earth before the end of time. Unlike the biblical flood, where destruction comes through water, here the emphasis is on the purifying element of fire. Although folk tales feature the rebirth of nature, there is no convincing evidence that the Slavs had the idea of repeating cycles of the end of the world, as in the Mayan or Hindu traditions. However, the concept of the destruction of the old world before the creation of a new one can still be found in some beliefs. For example, in fairy tales, you can find stories about the destruction of a kingdom or land, which is then reborn in a new, renewed form. Slavic end-time beliefs, while not written down in sacred texts as in the Abrahamic religions, were passed down orally, often in the form of cryptic prophecies and folklore. The key idea is inevitability. If the world loses its divine order and descends into chaos, it will collapse, after which a new era is possible. These themes resonate in later Slavic culture, including fairy tales, folklore, and even 19th century literature. Thus, while die Slavs do nicht have ein strict end-time scenario like other cultures, their mythology reflects universal themes of cyclical renewal and the hope of recovery from destruction. Germanic and Celtic mythologies do nicht offer ein single, clearly defined scenario for the end of the world, such as, for example, the Scandinavian Ragnarok. However, there contain many elements related to the idea of destruction, ein final battle, and possible renewal, which can be seen as eine kind of end-time prophecy. These myths emphasize the fragility of the world order and its dependence on the balance of power between gods, humans, and spirits. Among the Germanic peoples, the most famous myth about the end of the world is Ragnarok, described in the Scandinavian tradition. However, there are other lesser-known Germanic legends in which the world is destroyed in eine große battle of the gods, or because of ein breakdown in communication between people and higher powers. Some Germanic tales speak of the coming of the Black Sun, a sign of the end of times, when the world will be plunged into darkness, and the forces of chaos will emerge from their hiding places. This motif echoes the idea of Fimbulwinter, the eternal winter before Ragnarok. An important element of Germanic and Celtic myths is the idea of the return of sleeping heroes in times of greatest danger. For example, the legends of King Arthur, who has both Celtic and Germanic roots, say that he is not dead, but merely sleeping in a secret place, and will return when Britain is in greatest danger. This motif is also found in the myths of Frederick Barbarossa, who is said to sleep in a mountain cave and will one day awaken to save Germany. These legends do not so much predict the end of the world as promise hope for rebirth in the darkest hour. Celtic mythology, unlike Germanic mythology, is much less focused on the end of the world in the usual sense. However, it does contain motifs of the destruction of worlds and the transition between eras. One such idea is the concept of the times of the winds, periods when different worlds collide with each other, are destroyed, or disappear. For example, Irish mythology tells of the coming of the Tuatha De Danann, a divine people who ruled Ireland, but then gave way to humans. Their world did not disappear completely, but went into another dimension, becoming invisible to ordinary mortals. Some versions of the legends say that they can return and restore their power, which can be interpreted as a form of renewal of the world after its destruction. Another important motif in Celtic mythology is the eternal cycles of destruction and rebirth. Unlike the linear ideas about the end of the world, as in the Christian tradition, the Celts perceived the world as constantly changing. In legends about the battles of the gods for ancient lands, for example, the myth of the death of the city of Da Lakhta, which allegedly sank underwater, one can see echoes of the idea that the old order always gives way to the new. An important role in Celtic prophecies was played by the Druids, priests and soothsayers who could predict the future. Some legends speak of Druids warning of impending destruction if people forget ancient traditions and lose touch with the gods. This motif is reminiscent of Slavic ideas about the loss of harmony as a harbinger of the end of time. Despite the lack of a clear concept of the end of the world, Germanic myths contain many elements characteristic of eschatological beliefs. A great battle, the destruction of the old world, the return of ancient heroes, and cycles of renewal. These ideas influenced European culture, especially in the legends of King Arthur, tales of sleeping warriors, and folk beliefs about sunken lands that will one day rise again from the depths. In modern culture, motifs of Germanic Celtic eschatology live on in literature, film, and philosophical concepts. The idea of sleeping heroes preparing for battle in times of danger is reflected in the plots of fantasy and science fiction. The idea that the world may collapse not suddenly, but through gradual changes, is similar to modern theories about global crisis, climate change, and the loss of cultural traditions. So while the Germanic myths do not give us a single scenario for the end of the world, they do reflect important ideas. The world order is not eternal, but destruction is always followed by rebirth. And even in the darkest times, there is hope for restoration of what has been lost. African and oceanic doomsday myths, unlike European and Middle Eastern traditions, do not always present the catastrophe as a final destruction of the world. In many cases, it is a return of the universe to its original state, a cyclical renewal, or a divine punishment that can be reversed if people change their behavior. These myths are closely linked to ideas about the harmony between nature, gods, and society, with destruction perceived as an inevitable consequence of disrupting this balance. There are myths among the peoples of Africa where the gods, disappointed in humanity, decide to destroy it. For example, in the mythology of the Yoruba people, there is a concept of the supreme god Olorun, who created the world and people, but left the management to the lower deities, Orisha. However, if humanity loses its moral principles and begins to forget about its creators, the gods can return the world to the state of primordial chaos from which it was created. In this myth, the end of the world is associated not with final destruction, but with the idea of correction. Destruction can be prevented if people restore harmony with divine forces. Other African peoples, such as the Zulu and Dogon, tell of a giant celestial serpent-like creature that will one day descend from the sky and scorch the earth with its fiery breath. The Dogon have stories of a falling star that will cause chaos and bring about the end of time. These stories can be interpreted as mythologizing natural disasters, such as meteorites or massive droughts that may have affected ancient civilizations. Oceanic mythologies, especially Polynesian mythologies, often feature the motif of a giant wave that will one day wash away the entire world. Maori myths tell of a coming day when the ocean will swallow up the land and the earth will be destroyed, only to be reborn. Some Pacific Island peoples have tales of baths of the gods that bring famine and natural disasters to humanity when it loses touch with its traditions and ancestors. These myths may be linked to memories of tsunamis, which do pose a serious threat to island civilizations. Interestingly, Polynesian and African myths often include the idea that the end of the world is not an irreversible death, but rather a warning. Even in the case of famine and natural disasters, people always have the opportunity to restore balance and prevent the final catastrophe. This distinguishes them from Western concepts of the end of the world, where the idea of irreversible death is more common. Thus, African and oceanic doomsday myths do not simply destruction, but emphasize the need to maintain harmony between gods, nature, and humans. These myths remind us that the fate of the world depends on human actions, and that perhaps disaster is not an inevitability, but a warning. Ideas about the end of the world have always reflected fears that were relevant to a particular society in a particular era. In ancient times, these were floods and droughts. In the Middle Ages, diseases and religious prophecies. And today, fears have acquired a more technological character. Climate catastrophe, nuclear war, artificial intelligence. Eschatology is a mirror of society, reflecting its anxieties and ideas about the future. It has been noted that during periods of social and political upheaval, talk of the end of the world becomes especially frequent. When the usual order collapses, there is a feeling that the world is really approaching its end. For example, at the end of the Roman Empire, many believed that the apocalypse had already begun. Since there were wars all around, the economy was in decline, and barbarians were advancing on the borders. In the Middle Ages, outbreaks of plague and famine were perceived as signs of Judgment Day. In the 20th century, fears of nuclear war resulted in the popularity of post-apocalyptic scenarios in which humanity destroys itself. If we compare ancient myths with modern doomsday theories, we can see that they work on a similar principle. In mythology, the end of the world comes from the wrath of the gods, or the destructive forces of nature, and then comes renewal. Today, fears are also associated with destruction, which may be followed by a reset of civilization, either in the form of a technological singularity or a new ecological reality. Climate change is often seen as a new Great Flood, threatening to destroy coastal cities and lead to global chaos. Fears of artificial intelligence are reminiscent of stories of titans rising or demons running amok. Nuclear war is essentially a modern-day Ragnarok, a battle in which there will be no winners. Eschatology thus not only reflects fears, but also helps society understand crises. These scenarios, no matter how grim, show that humanity always faces either rebirth or catastrophe. The choice between them is up to us.